You guys, welcome back to another week of art. I am super excited to see you. I hope that you're super excited to see me. We have a pretty cool lesson planned for this week, so I hope that you can follow along and complete this work of art. So we're going to be talking about two things this week. The first thing is landscapes, and the second thing is the Harlem Renaissance. Maybe you've heard of both of those things, but I'm going to explain a little bit about what they are before we get started. So in a landscape, usually there is an image of land, right? Whether it is the sea, like this picture is, whether it is mountains, whether it's the city, right? It's a picture of some kind of land, okay? And then in a landscape, there's a few different parts. This first part is called the background, right? Everything has a background. Usually the background is always going to be the sky. So this part of our painting back here is our background. Then there's a part of the painting called the middle ground. If you look really carefully, there are some trees and land and some buildings over here that's kind of on the horizon where the water touches the sky. That would be called the middle ground because that's kind of the part that's in between the background and then the foreground. The foreground is the part of the painting or image that is the closest to you. So if you were looking at this painting, you would feel like maybe you were standing right at the water's edge, looking out over the water, across to the middle ground, and then the background was behind that. So our foreground in this case is the water, maybe even some of the ships might be in the foreground, maybe some of them would be in the middle ground. But so that's basically the elements that make up a landscape. We are going to be making a cityscape. So we are going to be painting, we're going to be drawing, we're going to be collaging our own cityscape. All right, so it's going to be images of buildings that we layer on top of each other. The Harlem Renaissance was a movement right here in New York City and maybe even in your own neighborhood that occurred from about like 1912 to the mid 1930s. So if you live or go to school in Harlem, then you live in the same neighborhood that this amazing art movement occurred. So basically it was a time when a lot of different artists and thinkers lived in the same area of New York. They lived in Harlem and they were artists of color and they really wanted to express their culture and history of what it had been like growing up in America as an African American, and how they could express that as artists was a little bit different than other people before them. Some of these artists include Aaron Douglas, Jacob Lawrence, Lois Jones, and Romare Bearden. Those were just some of the visual artists of the time. The Harlem Renaissance was a movement that included literature, so writing and poetry. It included music, and it included all kinds of different artists, right? Some painters, some drawers, some sculptors. So it was this really awesome, diverse time for Harlem to express itself, its history, and its culture. When you look at a lot of those artists' work, there's a lot of bright colors, there's a lot of sharp patterns, right? Textures and things being overlapped to create these compositions. We're going to kind of use the idea of overlapping different materials to create our cityscape. So we'll have a little bit of influence from the Harlem Renaissance. We're going to be doing a cityscape, right? So maybe your cityscape is actually going to be an image of Harlem or the Bronx or wherever you live or are growing up. And we are going to use some of that landscape, some of those landscape elements to kind of bring our whole piece of art together. So follow along with these steps, and I'm super excited to see how you guys do with this. So to get started on our Harlem Renaissance inspired landscape, what we're going to do first is we're going to do our background, right? So the background of a landscape is the part that is furthest back. So usually that is going to be the sky. So I'm going to use my crayons and I'm going to pull out a few different colors that I can kind of blend together to make my sky. And I'm going to cover the entire white sheet of paper with kind of like I think I'm going to do like a sunset kind of sky. All right, so I'm going to pick out a bunch of colors that I can put together and that are going to make a really cool sunset when I blend them. All right. So that's what you guys are going to do. No scribble scrabbles, right? Keep your hand moving side to side and cover your whole white sheet of paper with your sky background. Okay, so now I have this like cool sunset sort of blended background. All right, so this is going to be the sheet of paper that I'm going to work on top of. All right, so I just kind of like overlapped my colors. You could see I did some warm colors, I did some cool colors, and I kind of just blended them on top of each other until I got the background that I wanted. All right, now what we're going to do is we're going to take some foil and we're gonna cut it into some skinny rectangles. What we're gonna do is we're going to print these rectangles on top of our background, and that's gonna be our middle ground. So we're gonna kind of have these buildings for our cityscape that are gonna be in shadow, okay? So the first thing that I'm gonna do to do that is I'm gonna take my foil and really carefully, because it's pretty delicate, I'm just gonna cut out some rectangles, some tall, skinny rectangles, right, that are going to be my buildings. And let's see, I'm going to do like, maybe I'll try and do like 8 rectangles for across the middle ground of my cityscape. And they can be all different sizes and lengths. Okay, so now I have these rectangular shapes cut out. What I'm going to do with these rectangles is actually use them to print my middle ground, and I'll tell you how we're going to do that in a second. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to choose kind of the tallest rectangles, right? Because these are going to be my buildings. So I'm going to choose the tallest ones to print first. And the other ones I'm just going to put off to the side. Okay, I'm gonna print in 2 different colors. If you don't have 2 different colors of paint to print with, then you definitely can just do this with 1 color, okay? So what I'm gonna do is I'm going to take some paint, some acrylic paint. You can get this at like a craft store. The dollar store has little bottles of acrylic paint, but if you want a special color, maybe you can get it at a craft store, or you can order it on Amazon. So I'm going to use a little bit of this acrylic paint. If you don't have acrylic paint, then you can use the marker and watercolor technique that we saw in the last week's videos. All right, so I'm gonna just put a little bit of paint on my extra foil. Put it to the side. And what I'm gonna do is I'm going to paint on a piece of scratch paper so I don't get my table dirty. I'm gonna paint this rectangle, totally cover it in my blue. All right. I have to still be gentle because my foil is delicate and I don't want it to rip. All right, so I have my blue. Now before this dries, and it's really important that you do this quick, right? Before it dries, I'm going to take it and flip it over and lay it down flat. Make sure my fingers are clean and print it onto my background. Lift it off. Okay, so that was really light, so I'm gonna need to do a little bit more paint on top of it. So let me try again. I'm gonna take my paint. Now I know I need to put a little bit more on. Really paint my rectangle carefully. Get a really good coat. And I'm going to do the same thing just on top of where I just printed so that I make that a little bit darker. All right, and just gently press it down. so the paint goes onto my background. All right, let's see how this looks the second time. Yeah, that's better. All right, so now this piece of foil is done. I'm gonna kind of just ball it up and put to the side. And I'm gonna do the same thing for the rest of these tall buildings that I printed, or that I cut out and I'm gonna print with. All right, I finished printing my blue rectangles. Some of them came out really great, like this one. Some of them aren't perfect, but you know what? That's totally fine for now because I'm gonna keep printing my middle ground. All right, so I'm gonna go in with the rest of my rectangles that I cut out for myself, and I'm gonna print with some black paint now, some more buildings that are kind of gonna like overlap on top of these. And this is what's gonna finish up my middle ground. And then we're gonna be done with this for the day because we're gonna have to wait for the rest of the paint to dry in the middle ground before we add anything else on top for a foreground, which is the part that is gonna be the closest to the front, all right, the front of the landscape. I'm gonna do the same thing I did before. I'm gonna pour a little bit of black paint out for myself. I'm gonna take my first rectangle. I'm actually gonna switch these. I'm gonna take my first rectangle and I'm going to paint it. Make sure I give it a nice thick coat of paint. Okay, and then I'm going to, when I'm done, lay it down where I want it to kind of overlap, maybe on top of this blue one that I printed. And I'm gonna press on the back of it gently so I don't rip it. And then I'm gonna lift it up and see what that printed like. Cool, I like that. If you want it to be a little darker, you definitely can. Remember, if you only have one color of paint at home, then you can definitely just do this with one color, right? So just print as many rectangles as you can and then be done. All right, that one's good. I'm gonna put it to the side and I'm gonna go on to the next one. All right, so this is where we're going to stop for today. In the next video, you're gonna see how we add the foreground, okay? So the part of the cityscape that is the closest to us. But right now, we need to let this middle ground dry, okay? So I think it's gonna look really cool. Even if yours doesn't quite look like a city yet, you'll see once we add the buildings in the front, it's definitely going to look like this awesome Harlem Renaissance inspired cityscape. All right, so great job today, guys, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.